All right. Am I on? I'm on. Am I on? Great. So I thought this was a good close to the three speakers. So we had a provider, right? A hospital. By the way, I'm Alan Ying, in case you couldn't tell. We had a hospital with Dr. Nash, and then we had a payer, and then now we have a pharma company to talk about data and convergence, which, as far as maybe total market size, pillars of the healthcare market, I think that that's appropriate. So what I want to do is start and ask with the good overview of how is the pharmaceutical community looking at how they use data and what was important before, and assuming that there's been some type of shakeup and they've seen that the world has changed. What is the nature of that change and how pharmaceutical companies look at data and what's important to them now? What was it before and what is it now?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm sorry to say that nothing has changed. We're just chugging along. Everything's just going gangbusters. So no story here.
Good to know.
No, clearly.
I'm getting some Twitter feedback on that.
Is that right? Clearly, the world has changed dramatically for pharma. Whether it's our interactions with payers and anxiety about reimbursement for products, an uncertain regulatory environment, healthcare reform, R&D challenges, the list goes on and on. And as we look to reinvent, as we look to new solutions, it's interesting to look at the role that data has played in pharmaceutical companies to date and what role it is going to play going forward. Because there was a great line my CEO, Ian Reed, had used at the Cleveland Clinic last fall. He used the story that we don't just sell pills, we sell data. And it's interesting to look at the likes of Pfizer as a data company, because manufacturing a chemical really isn't that challenging, right? It's the ability to generate data on its quality, on its efficacy, on its safety, but then not just generate that data, analyze that data, and be able to communicate that data to a host of different stakeholders, to providers, to payers, to the government, to patients. So it's an interesting analog to think about the role that data has played at the likes of Pfizer to date. But now going forward, the increased appreciation that, all that data we generate, it's nothing compared to all of the other electronic data that everybody else has about our products.
So standing outside the pharmaceutical community, at Chrysalis we invest in non-life science healthcare, but when you look at it, you think in general, physician detailing and clinical trials data. And now there's this movement over the last several years of being awash in, EMR data, where there's actually more data being generated at an appreciable amount. There's social media. There's personal health records that are online. There's all sorts of things that intellectually could be used for the data that you need to convince doctors or convince patients or convince hospitals. How is it that your business or you're seeing the industry adopt that or embrace it or push it off?
Sure. And that list goes on, right? So we have longitudinal structured clinical data. We have patient-generated quantified self-data, patient self-reported data. We have all the genomics data and all of the other omics and molecular data that goes along as well. But it's interesting to look across the entire development continuum at the range of how that type of data is used today. So these aren't just interesting use cases about ways that we could use this data if only it were available, because it is available and we are using it. We're using it in research in order to validate a hypothesis in places where maybe there is no robust data to back up that research hypothesis. We're using it in clinical research when we're planning a new study protocol to test its feasibility or look for patients or look for sites. We're using it in health economics and outcomes research in terms of real-world data that's available to understand how our products are being used in the real world. Obviously, as you alluded to, from a commercial perspective, and the market analytics that we look at around our products and our sales force and how they use that information. So there's this broad continuum of how the data that's available outside of Pfizer's walls are being used from the earliest stages of development right through to loss of exclusivity.
So I'm going to bring an example up just where it appears to have some convergent impact, and I'd encourage you guys to think of examples also, but I'll start it off and we can ask. So we're invested in a business that does genetic testing, genomic testing. So someone gets a cancer, and the tissue sample is tested for its genome, and there's identified X number of mutations. And what that does is it dictates which chemotherapy regimen to use, because statistically 70% of all chemotherapy fails first time around. So they're batting 300, which is great in baseball and is not great in medical treatment. So there's a 70% failure rate, but you turn it up to 80% success rate if you have the genomic indicators and you pair it with the chemotherapy regimens. Now, there's a lot of interactions in that business with payers, because obviously at $25,000 a pop plus for a chemotherapy regimen, they're interested in not having a 70% failure rate. With that type of innovation and taking data that, genomic data is typically thought of as life science and biotech, and kind of bringing it into the service side and then including the payer in that. That's an example of convergence as I see it. Are those types of business model, evolutions something that Pfizer is considering, and how do they look at that?
Not only are we considering it, but when you look at our R&D portfolio and the commitments that we've made, we're anticipating it and almost relying on it, and to a certain extent. So you're absolutely right. Genomic data used to be a phenomenon of the researcher. It was left to the guys in the white lab coats. And then you look at the collaboration that Pfizer put in place about a year ago with Medco. And so a pharma and a payer collaborating, and the essence of that collaboration was collaborative research around personalized and precision medicine. So how do we best understand which patient subpopulations our medicines work best in, which is of interest to both groups? When you look at the medicines that Pfizer has brought to market, crizotinib most recently for lung cancer, they're relying on the ability to better isolate and subtype disease. That lung cancer is not one lung cancer, but it's 20 or 30 or 50 different diseases, and we may need 20 different products to address all the different molecular subtypes that are out there. But then we also start to appreciate that, well, this genetic variant of lung cancer actually bears a lot in common with the similar genetic variant in a different tumor type. So maybe it's okay from a market perspective that we only have a small percent in lung cancer, because there may be other diseases, other cancers in that case, with a similar genetic profile. So the opportunities for us around precision and personalized medicine are very important to Pfizer going forward, and the ability for those diagnostics to be available in the clinic are central to then making those products actually accessible.
Before I go on and ask another question, does anyone have any questions about convergence and the big data boom and how the pharmaceutical industry may be approaching it? All right, so what I want to know is, the core operations of the life science industry for the glory days of the last 30 years has been taking an original patent protectable innovation, a discovery, and moving it through a process and then getting the maximum value of it over time. This onset of more electronically available data and information is really a phenomenon over the last 5 years probably, which is a short period of time when generationally the whole industry is used to a way of operating. For the entrepreneurs and businesses in the audience, where is it that life science businesses, pharma companies, medtech, biotech, where are they getting the expertise to address this? How are they even solving it? You have the senior-most person is a 30-year veteran that has learned how to do X, and there is no more X, or there's very little X, and now there's Y of you got to focus on this, and that's not a core expertise within that business. So how is it that you guys are addressing those challenges?
That is a very real challenge in that, if you look at our clinical research enterprise as an example, we have people that know how to work with data, but they know how to work with clinical trial data, internally generated data. And now all of a sudden they're getting handed pipes of data pouring in from EMRs, from payers, and so on, and they don't have the right skill sets there. But we do have the right skill sets in other pockets of the company. And so it becomes important for us to figure out organizationally how we can take advantage of somebody that was once just in the epidemiology department or once just in the health economics department, and take advantage of that know-how across the enterprise, wherever that data may ultimately flow. But ultimately, here's a fun little anecdote. I had a friend at an undisclosed pharma company, but it is not Pfizer.
You guys talk to each other? Really?
Once in a blue moon, mostly at these meetings. But he, like a lot of other companies in this space, was aggressively recruiting a health informatics trained physician, which is obviously a hot commodity. And he lost this physician not to another pharma company, but to an academic medical center. And he looked at me with this woeful expression and said, "Since when can't pharma outbid an academic medical center to get that kind of talent?"
No, I guess David's not here.
But it's very competitive, and these individuals that have these unique skill sets that are trained around that new data are certainly of a lot of interest right now.
Interesting. So, so I have a question about, if when you're head of clinical innovation, and so you probably, and we spoke backstage, you had some exposure into kind of the investment area of the business. What are the activities that pharma companies are taking? I mean, it's one thing to see the wave coming, and then it's another thing to say, okay, we're going to either pile sandbags up or we're going to dig a canal or do something related to participating in the innovation community and either finding companies or beta testing companies. So, for example, there's a clear trend nowadays as an investor that I see that is very obvious in payers, which did not used to be the case. Is our United speaker still around? So every payer that we run into that is that we see, and we know a lot of them on the Medicaid side, the Medicare side, on the private side, they've actually put up divisions that are run by former venture capitalists, strategists, et cetera, and they are taking a lot of risk on beta testing, probably a lot of the companies that may be showing up here or in other conferences like this, small companies, and doing pilots with them in meaningful subpopulations. That is that has probably been in the last 3 years. The 20 years before that, these last 3 years, that was not the case. So how is it that your industry is participating and dipping the toe in the water to be able to do that?
Sure. And you see some different pharma taking some different strategies right now, where some are hunkering down and focusing on their pharma core, and others are still trying to diversify or support what already was a diversified portfolio. Pfizer does have a venture group, much as many of our peers do, and increasingly we have been supportive of diversifying that portfolio of investments beyond life sciences, biotech pharma companies, beyond diagnostics companies, and into some other adjacent areas. I wouldn't necessarily look at pharma as a big exit strategy, because
take notes, startup CEOs.
Well, Pfizer, perhaps you've heard of it. We generate a lot of revenue off of our pharma products each year, and so unless your tech is going to come in and throw off $250 million, $500 million, it's not really going to be much more than a blip. So I think, you're better off outside of pharma. That's my opinion, not the opinion necessarily of my employer, but certainly pharma could be a very important partner, could be a very important strategic investor early on, an important partner for testing and developing that new technology, that new service, that new adjacency.
So there was the venture capitalist who was up earlier from Claremont Creek was indicating that, taking pause and looking at half his portfolio is tech, half is, healthcare, and, the effect of an early strategic investor. For you, because that reduces the long-term possible exit value, because, hey, they're going to want a hometown discount or for early investor discount on the exit. You're saying pharma is, insofar as it's not a molecule or drug development company, that's not the case. The investment may just be to actually get the financial value and be able to have them as a key partner.
So I will say our venture group invests for financial return. They are not just a strategic entity throwing capital around. They're going to want to know that there will be a return on that investment. But that being said, the assumption isn't always that the exit is within Pfizer. We don't necessarily just invest to set ourselves up as a favorable acquirer later on. And likewise, look, it's 2012. By the time your new company matures and is ready to pop, everything I just said, well, except for YouTube, everything I just said might be completely irrelevant by then, right? So, maybe by then the cycle will be, smaller diversification in that way is the flavor. I think that's part of the reason that our venture group does like to diversify their investments in different areas, because, the cycles can be rather long for some of these areas, and we don't know where the winds will shift over the coming years. So it's almost an interesting way to keep a chip in different areas.
So I want to make sure before I ask the next question. Anyone have something for pharma? All right.
Yeah, I work for Medtronic, that's a medical device manufacturer, and there's been a number of discussions today about people wanting to move upstream and downstream, people consolidating horizontally or vertically. And I'm curious in pharmaceuticals what that means for you to move, because unless it somehow is involved in pharmaceuticals, that is molecules, it's not entirely clear to me where it fits into your strategy. If, for example, I remember the disease management sites that pharmaceutical companies had for many years, but they really weren't hopefully I'm not offending you, they didn't seem like real disease management sites. They seemed like marketing sites to sell a drug. Depression.com was to sell Prozac, and MS.com was to sell whatever drug was for MS. So I'm curious, as you think about moving more broadly into being a healthcare services company, if in fact you are, what does that mean with a pharmaceutical core? And why does tacking it onto a pharmaceutical company make it more valuable than just letting some other company do whatever that upstream or downstream activity is?
So I'm not purporting that Pfizer, as an example, is exclusively a pharma company or exclusively a health services company, but I think that there is an appreciation that our medicines don't work in isolation, and that today any product that we've launched over the last couple of years has included some aspect of coaching and other support around it. But that being said, that's not our core business, right? We're not going to develop that necessarily as a standalone business. But I was actually going to ask you, am I upstream or downstream? I think who our customer is in this process has changed a lot over the last few years, and how we're communicating with all of those different customers that we have to interact with has certainly changed as well. But I think that going forward, I'm sure we'll continue to look for those new ways to interact with patients, but it will be with partners. It's not the core of what Pfizer is developing internally.
I think that means 0 means we should stop. Sorry we didn't get to more questions. So I want to thank everyone for your attention, and thanks very much for coming and telling us about Pfizer.